Dragons come in all shapes and sizes, from whiskered Chinese dragons to wyverns to the classic Welsh dragon silhouette. Very few dragons around the world even have the same arrangement of limbs and wings. And yet, out of all these different types of beasts, there is one, my most local kind of dragon, that has possibly the strangest arrangement of limbs and things, and many cooler features besides. So today, as part of Dragon Week, a week-long celebration of all things dragon by TTRPG creators across the internet, I want to tell you all about Lindworms. Lindworms are perhaps the most populous kind of dragon in the legends of the northeast of England, but they're not all we have here, and they're not from here. Lindworms are imported, alongside the Vikings, the Scandinavians, the Germanic peoples, into England. Fafnir is possibly the most famous example of this kind of dragon, but my local examples of the lambton worm and the laidley worm are also pretty big in at least this region. And the 19th century King Lindworm is another really prevalent example. What unifies all of these creatures? Well, they're possibly the least impressive looking of all dragons. Serpentine dragons, ones who have no limbs at all and just kind of slither across the ground, are cool enough. And wyverns, whose forelimbs are wings and whose rear limbs are just legs, have pretty impressive showings on shows like a Game of Thrones. They're, hunched over scary fellas. Lindworms have 2 clawed forearms and no other limbs. Not quite that menacing snake-like slithering, and of course they have no wings either. Just a creature that part pulls itself forwards with its arms and part winds its way through the landscape like a snake. Like some sort of mer-snake, really. Very much like a mer-serpent, Lindworms are kind of associated with water. Frankly, water is one of the only places that such a unfortunately arranged beast could thrive at all. Swimming through murky water like an anaconda, perhaps, and using its claws to present a greater threat than simply a winding giant snake. Many of the tales of Lindworms include river or sea crossings. Indeed, both Fafnir and the lambton worm are killed because a warrior knight sort of creature with a plan is hiding in a river. And the laidley worm steers a ship to shore through the sea. Other stark and quite distinct features of Lindworm tales include their acidic breath, their destructive and fouling presence on the environment in the local area, and weirdly, a taste for livestock, especially the milk of livestock. These are genuinely some of the really common features of Lindworms across myth and legend. 2 of the more complex Lindworm stories on offer are the Danish King Lindworm and the Northumbrian Laidley Worm. Both of these tales also share some really quite striking similarities. Strangely, both of these dragons have a human form. King Lindworm tells the tale of a prince who is born as this draconic creature because of a curse, and ends up terrorising his kingdom, his parents and his twin brother, by demanding to be brought princesses so that they may marry him, and then proceeding to eat those princesses, until he is tricked by a shepherd's daughter into tearing apart the layers of his flesh until eventually that reveals his princely form underneath. The Laidley Worm is the story of a princess with a wicked stepmother who turns the princess into a lindworm until her lost brother returns. She's given offerings of livestock by the locals and the peasants, who feel sympathy for this Laidley Worm. So-called Laidley because it's literally laidily, a lady worm. Her brother returns from fighting on the continent to a magical onslaught, defensive onslaught around their castle, made by the wicked stepmother, protected by his rowanwood ship, and of course, his worm sister's guidance through the waves. When they arrive on shore, the brother goes to slay the hideous beast, but pauses, and instead gives it 3 kisses, and after 3 kisses, the girl is transformed back into a princess. And then he goes off to deal with the wicked witch. Honestly, this tale is like fairy tale Mad Libs. I love it. Wicked stepmother curses a princess, making her both a damsel in distress and a dragon simultaneously, to be rescued by a warrior prince with 3 kisses before he then goes off to deal with the witch. In spite of the stuffing of tropes, we can see something quite unique emerging in this tale. Lindworms are themselves a curse. The lantern worm appears to the protagonist of that tale after he skipped church to go fishing, for goodness sake. And Fafnir is transformed into a worm because he kills his dad. And all of these creatures, like many mythic beasts, must be countered with a trick. Siegfried kills Fafnir by hiding on a dried out riverbed. John Lantern kills his worm by wearing spiked armour and hoping that the creature coiling around him, trying to crush him to death, will cut itself to pieces instead. King Lindworm is tricked into ripping off his own skin 9 times, which... dude, come on. And the Laidley worm needs you to overcome its horrific nature and give it 3 kisses to reverse the curse. Without a really clever tactic or the specific know-how usually given by, a wise woman in the woods, these creatures are really hard, if not impossible, to kill. The lantern worm can reform from its constituent parts, even if you chop it into pieces, like they do say often about worms. Earthworms, although actually about earthworms that's not true. If you cut an earthworm in half, even on the raised bit, it's gonna die. You killed it. Don't do that. Public service announcement, I guess. Coiling is another feature really common to these beasts because they're massive gigantic snake things with a couple of front claws, really. The lantern worm loops, famously, 10 times round Penshire Hill, and the Laidley worm has an entire depression in the natural environment named after where it's supposedly coiled up depressed. So what are we supposed to do with all of this fun, but ultimately fairly useless information after all you've just learned about a kind of dragon that is not terribly cool? Well, I like Lindworms, despite the fact that they're objectively not quite as dynamic or cool as many of the other dragons that do have representation in D&D. So in the spirit of community, making Dragon Week cool and showcasing something awesome, I made one. I made the Lindworm into a monster stat block usable with D&D 2024, using all of the features we just discussed about this creature. Let's go through it now, together, before I give you some ideas about how to use this strange, cool creature in your game. We'll start with the traits of a Lindworm. Making these creatures amphibious is kind of a no-brainer, given what we've already discussed in terms of the legends, and the fact that they're long snake-like creatures with 2 front limbs. Their movement through the water seems like probably the easiest way to get around, frankly. It's also reasonable that they're a little bit faster in water as well, and that maybe they can burrow a little bit with these, these 4 limbs and kind of being like a snake with digging claws, basically. Their immense resilience and capacity to reform, demonstrated by King Lindworm ripping off his skin 9 times, and the lantern worm's regenerative properties are demonstrated best by the reforming body feature. If the Lindworm hasn't been slashed or pierced in the last round, essentially, and all of its body parts are still in contact with each other, the beast can heal basically indefinitely. This turns a rather standard monster into something of a puzzle fight, for which forward planning and research are generally quite important, lest you be bashing at this creature for rounds upon rounds upon rounds and rounds, wondering why it won't die. Mechanically, this will usually at most get the Lindworm a kind of last gasp around after the party thinks they've properly killed it stone dead for good. But against some parties, this might require weapon swaps or tactical swaps to get the parts of this beast apart and keep them apart, to make sure the thing doesn't keep coming back and trying again. It also gives GMs some story potential, which we'll discuss a bit later, in stopping an enemy from reforming pieces of a dead Lindworm. Slithering Doom is probably the most powerful feature of this worm's kit, and it should be treated as such. It's a real cornerstone of its strategy. Inspired by the befouling and cursed presence of these creatures, and their legendary propensity for coiling around victims, this trait is effectively a ticking clock for creatures that get too close, emphasising the Lindworm's close-up capabilities in combat. Players, I find, are very wary of continuous damage over time being done to them in any capacity, and it often provokes a not too rational fear in them, very much disproportionate to the threat, considering most combats in this game finish after 3 or 4 rounds. This noxious aura of doom is intended to provoke exactly that reaction, while also providing some small mechanical justification for the Lindworm's destruction of its own environment nearby. It also makes the relatively low close-up damage potential of the creature for a CR12 more beefy, forcing creatures that are trapped in its coils or affected by a charge by its lunge ability, for instance letting it get in close, to suffer additionally. As for actions, most of the time the Lindworm should be using its multi-attack in close range to claw, bite, and use its coil, which hopefully will damage creatures in close range and keep at least one there with the coiling ability. Because of how nasty its acid breath is likely to be, I've added some acid damage to the bite, and the claw attack is a nice little bonus if you do hit. Coil is the fun and slightly more complicated attack, though. It allows our Lindworm to grapple creatures in the coils of its long serpentine body, damaging them in the process and keeping them close enough so that its slithering doom keeps getting activated on them. The acid breath weapon is a big kind of group softener. It deals some significant damage, but crucially it allows the Lindworm to deal some damage to creatures that are further away from it, because this is quite a melee focused creature otherwise. Also because they're not that fast, especially when compared to other true dragons. As for legendary actions, my Lindworm has some pretty cool options that reflect its characteristics in Legend. First, recoil reflects its prowess in survival and staying alive by giving it something of a defensive option. A defensive option which causes all attacks against it to be made with disadvantage as it coils up into itself, but which prohibits it from using actions or reactions until the start of its next turn. So no attacks of opportunity and no more legendary actions. So it's a bit of a risk-reward play whether you want to use this defensive option early in the turns to come after you, or whether you want to get some hits in first. This defensive option isn't purely defensive though, because recoil also means that you're less likely to kill the creature before the next tick of slithering doom damage on any creature that is caught within its coils. Lunge is a kind of classic design feature of many of the true dragons in 2024 D&D. I've swapped the word pounce in the other dragons to lunge because I feel like it's more difficult to pounce when you haven't got hind limbs and you've just got 4 arms and a snake tail. Crush, again, is another ability designed to deal some extra damage to those creatures that are coiled up within the creature's coil attack, making this a real stack of damage incoming to creatures, making the coil an incredibly scary threat. This solidifies the mechanical identity of the Lindworm as a creature that wants to get up close, grapple you in its coils, and crush the life out of you until you succumb to its foul odour and its strength. This echoes that long serpentine body they all have in Legends and their penchant for coiling. As for the Lair, I added a couple of features to make the beast more of a threat and more interesting of a threat. The first disincentivizes short rests and general hit dice recovery by reducing the value of any hit dice that are rolled by half. And the second creates opacity and obscurement in waterways to give the Lindworm a way to use its not inconsiderable stealth to sneak up on unsuspecting creatures in the waters below, giving the blind sight having Lindworm a way to sneak up on unsuspecting intruders into its lair, and allowing, mechanically, for fights to start a lot closer to enemies, because this creature is really quite vulnerable to ranged threats. So in essence, the Lindworm that I've designed here is mechanically a big grappling serpentine dragon, which damages you if you get too close, has some sneaky defensive options, and has ambush and escape routes in its local lair environment. A beast which is surprisingly tough to kill and to keep dead. To round all this off, for a full introduction to this monster, let me give you some plot hooks to bring a Lindworm into your game. First, the classic. A fairy tale-esque curse has transformed a person into a Lindworm, and our heroes must hunt it down, but with a mind to freeing the person cursed. This could make this beast into a lower level encounter if the curse-breaking element is made clear or researched beforehand. Something like the 3 kisses from a prince from the Ladylworm tale. But characters are also going to be demonstrated the suffering that comes from getting too close to this beast, especially if you make them kiss it 3 times. This makes for a challenging but survivable puzzle fight, even for as low as level 3 characters. Although it is genuinely very deadly for a level 3 group if the worm gets the drop on them and fires off an acid-spraying breath. That would be bad. It's the sort of puzzle fight you'd give someone if you were very confident in their ability to think tactically and sensibly. Alternatively, a Lindworm could be a curse on a local land or a family, perhaps manifested like the lantern worm was for fishing on holy days, breaking both religious and social taboo. Another potential setup for a Lindworm uses its lair situation to draw adventurers in. A cursed land where wounds heal slowly, and every so often someone who's just minding their own business by the murky waterway drops dead completely randomly. As in actual fact, that's just the Lindworm swimming by unseen. I find that custom monsters, homebrew monsters, and creatures that aren't in the official monster manuals, and creatures that haven't been in previous editions in any significant way, which the Lindworm has existed in previous editions, but this version is quite different to that. I feel that this is kind of prime real estate for a sort of mystery exploration investigation into a monster's habits, lair, and potential. A wilderness exploration session with some intrigue, capped off with a nasty fight, but a fight that you understand a bit better because you've done the research into the creature in the local environment, which makes this lesser used dragon quite useful indeed in a one-shot or something like that. Lastly, and this could spawn a campaign, you could use a Lindworm as a recurring villain, based pretty much entirely on its reforming body trait. Imagine a dragon slayer with a Lindworm's head mounted in his home, being robbed by a group who has found the rest of the creature's body and wants to rejoin the two and return it to life. How much decay? How many years might prevent this regeneration? What if an ancient Lindworm historically had information that you need right now, but bringing it back would cause a great risk? Perhaps a monastic order is dedicated to keeping the beast's parts separate across generations. Or perhaps with the head heavily guarded from superstition that it might come back, there's no way to use Speak with Dead on the creature, meaning any knowledge it might have had is lost. The Lindworm in this case would function kind of like a Dracolich, but with less of the undead spirit inhabiting bones flavour, and more of a kind of Arthurian curse that comes back when the time is right or wrong. Equally, it is a wonderful thing to throw at a group of players who think they know what they're doing, and once they separate the head from the body, realise a few sessions later that that doesn't necessarily stop someone from bringing the two together and sending it angrily right after them, probably at quite an inopportune moment as well. In any case, feel free to use the Lindworm. You will find its entire stat block linked down in the description, and hopefully the pinned comment as well, if I remember to do that. But assuming I do, enjoy. And I hope your players enjoy as well. But with all that said, I hope that this Monster Week, the Dragon Week, is an inspiring prospect for you. I know for a fact that there's many very interesting videos out there in the works, so tell me about your favourites in the comments, or tell me if you end up using this Lindworm. I'd be very interested to see or hear about that. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the thegrungeonmaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.